And I'd like to thank everyone for coming today, for taking the time, and for all of your support. So again, for the people who've just joined, please open the chat box and introduce yourself to the group. Let us know where you're joining from, whose territory you're currently residing, and make sure you select all panelists and attendees. Before we get started, some basic housekeeping for the webinar. First, the webinar is being recorded, so if you have to leave early, fear not, you can watch the rest later. You're welcome to use the chat box throughout the webinar to communicate with each other, but if you want to ask a question of the panelists, please use the Q&A panel, which is separate, so you have to look for that. Otherwise, we won't have someone monitoring the chat box specifically for questions, so please look for the Q&A panel. For those of you who are new, Sierra Club BC is an environmental charity. We recently celebrated our 50th anniversary in 2019, and we have a long legacy of environmental protection and public education. And under the leadership of our executive director, Hannah Askew, we're working to fulfill our vision of a healthy, life-sustaining planet where humans respect the dignity and interdependence of all living beings. Our mission is to support people stewarding abundant ecosystems and a stable climate while building resilient, equitable communities. And our strategic plan, Growing into Balance, outlines two main goals. It states that within the context of respecting Indigenous jurisdiction, we will, 1, support people stewarding abundant ecosystems and a stable climate, and 2, protect ecosystems and nurture their abundance to ensure a viable future for all. So the work that we are partnering with Seth Klein on really fits neatly into our strategic plan, especially around the goal of supporting people. So let's get right into it. I am very excited to introduce our panelists today. First, our guest of honor, longtime member and supporter of Sierra Club BC, we have author Seth Klein. Seth is the team lead and director of strategy with the Climate Emergency Unit. Prior to that, he served for 22 years as the founding director of the British Columbia office of the CCPA, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which is Canada's foremost social justice think tank. He's now a freelance policy consultant, speaker, researcher, and writer, and author of A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. And he is also an adjunct professor with Simon Fraser University's Urban Studies program and remains a research associate with the CCPA. So welcome, Seth. Very happy to have you. Next, we have Sierra Club BC's climate justice lead, Anjali Appadurai. Anjali is a climate justice advocate, communicator, and consultant. She began her career in international climate politics, organizing social justice movements around the UN climate space. Anjali then returned home to BC to work on building a community-driven class action lawsuit against some of the biggest names in the fossil fuel industry. Today, Anjali works to strengthen climate change discourse in Canada by centering the stories of those on the front lines of the climate crisis, excuse me. Anjali works with the Sierra Club BC team to support us in connecting climate change to the socioeconomic and political realities and supports our role as a strong contributor to the Canadian and global climate justice movement. Welcome, Anjali. And finally, we have Florence Baker, also known as Flossie, who is the lead organizer at Sierra Club BC. Her passion is supporting different communities to engage in building a new story about the future we face. With a background in journalism and communications, Flossie is interested in how the narratives we create shape our imagination for action. She trained as a community organizer under the Industrial Areas Foundation, the oldest community organizing network in North America, and brings stories and lessons in organizing from the UK, the San Francisco Bay Area, Victoria, and Vancouver. She now focuses on building relationships with labor unions and spiritual traditions, and she is based in East Vancouver. Glad to have you here, Flossie. So we'll start off by having Seth introduce his new book and some of the key concepts, and then we'll move into a conversation about the partnership with Sierra Club BC and the Climate Emergency Unit, and then we'll end the webinar with some time for questions from the audience. So Anjali, did you want to start us off with some questions for Seth?
Sure, yes. Happy Earth Day, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're so thrilled to have Seth. Oh, there he is. He's replacing his little avatar. I know that there's probably a mix of those of you who have read the book and those who haven't, but Seth, we're hoping that you could just give us a bit of background. first of all, why did you feel called to write this book? And what's the central argument that you're presenting?
Well, hi, everybody. Let me just, first of all, say hello to you, Ange, and Flossie, and Elizabeth. Thanks for that introduction, and really happy to be doing this with you all on Earth Day. As Elizabeth mentioned, I'm particularly happy to be doing it with Sierra Club BC, which I've been a long time supporter of, and grateful for your work. And I'm super grateful to be more formally partnered with you now with the Climate Emergency Unit, which I guess we'll tell you about later. But first on the book, why did I feel called upon to write the book? So I left the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives 2.5 years ago now, and set out to write this book. I wanted to focus more of my time on the climate emergency, mainly because I was increasingly panicked, like a lot of you, I suspect. And increasingly alarmed by this perpetual gap between what the science says we have to do and what our politics seems prepared to entertain. That's what I wanted to set out to tackle. And actually, there's a chart that I like to show that I think you're going to call up, which is Canada's greenhouse gas emissions over the last 20 years. There you go. And this is sort of my opening premise with the book, which is when you look at a chart like this, and by the way, if I were to call up British Columbia's GHG emissions, the chart looks basically the same. You know, the scale is different, but the look of it is the same, which is to say it's basically a flat plateaued line. I take this chart to be like a visual representation of Einstein's definition of insanity, which is to keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result. So I take as my opening premise that what we're doing isn't working and that we need a new approach to tackling the climate emergency.
Right. And you, well, I just wanted to also dig into a bit about your central parallel that you're drawing with the World War II mobilization.
Right, thank you. So that is indeed the original twist of the book, is that it is all structured around lessons from Canada's experience in the Second World War. And that evolved in the course of the writing. When I did my original book outline, I was going to have a single chapter on the lessons from the Second World War, because I had long been intrigued by the war as this example of rapid economic transformation. And for all of us who wrestle with this question of, you know, can we actually do what we need to do at the speed and scale required? The war is this helpful reminder that, yeah, we can, because we did. And in fact, we completely transitioned the economy twice. Once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert to peacetime. And the scale of that was extraordinary. I mean, to think about it in these terms. Out of a population at the time of a little over 11 million people, over 1 million Canadians enlisted, and more than that were directly employed in military production. So, you know, the scale of that is mind-boggling, isn't it? The more I dug into that history, the more I started to see more and more parallels, and ultimately decided to restructure the whole book around those lessons as this hopeful reminder that we've done this before.
Thank you. So Seth, in the book, you talk a lot about what you call the 4 pillars of emergency mode. Can you walk us through what those are and give some examples?
Yeah. The 4 markers of emergency. Yeah, in the book, I should say, actually, I try to pull all of these lessons into a 14-point plan that I call the battle plan for climate mobilization. So that's what's in the book. But the book's been out for 8 months now, and in each interview I get asked, you know, how do you know when a government is actually in emergency mode? And so I've been pressed to further distill this 400-page book into what I now call my 4 markers of emergency mode, and you see them on the slide there, which is, you know that a government is in emergency mode when it spends what it takes to win. It creates new economic institutions to get the job done. It moves from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures as required, and it tells the truth tells the truth about the gravity of the crisis. It communicates a sense of urgency, and it spells out clearly in a ubiquitous and coherent and consistent manner what we actually have to do to confront it. And if you reflect for a moment on those 4 markers, we did all of those things big time in the war. And you know, when I think about the pandemic, I would actually say our federal government also hits all of those markers. You know, we can quibble about the degree to which they've done those things, or whether they've done that sufficiently. But in different ways, they have done all 4 of those things. And consequently given us this reminder, oh yeah, this is what it looks and sounds and feels like when a government is actually in emergency mode, and how they talk to us. But on the flip side, none of our federal or provincial governments, they don't just miss some of those 4 markers. There isn't a single federal or provincial government in Canada that hits any of those 4 markers yet. That is the awkward moment, the phony war moment that we are in when it comes to the climate emergency.
Could you just say a little bit more about the new economic institutions piece, and maybe give a few examples from the Second World War?
Yeah, so just to give you a flavor of what that ramp up in military production was in the Second World War, from a base of virtually nothing, because in Canada at the time, we ended up producing 16,000 military aircraft and ultimately producing the 4th largest air force in the world at the time, 800,000 military vehicles, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. Here in our province, where we seem to struggle to build a single BC ferry anymore, we produced over 300 ships in the space of those 6 years. So that was remarkable. It took an unprecedented level of government spending. So federal spending increased tenfold in that time, far more than what we've seen even in this pandemic. But in terms of the new economic institutions, Flossie, directly to your question, you know, what's striking about that wartime experience is the degree to which the government was in a hurry. And anytime the private sector couldn't quickly do what they needed done, they created another crown corporation to do it. They ultimately created 28 crown corporations during the war. In contrast, the Trudeau government in its time in office has created 2 new crown corporations, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is basically a vehicle for privatizing infrastructure. And you know what the other one is? It's the one that makes us all the proud owners of a 60-year-old oil pipeline from Alberta to our province. It's the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation. The BC government has created no new crown corporations to get the job done. And I think this is important because if you're not creating new economic institutions like public enterprises, the best you can do is try to incentivize somebody else to do what needs doing, to build at a mass scale what we need to do. So the argument I'm making in the book is, like occurred in the war, we need to conduct an inventory of all of our conversion needs to decarbonize and electrify everything, right? How many wind turbines, how many solar arrays, how many electric buses, how many heat pumps, and then envision a new generation of public enterprises to produce and deploy those items at the requisite scale. But that's not what's happening yet. Even on Monday's budget, the whole approach to producing all of those things that we now need is to basically offer a corporate tax cut in the hopes that somebody else will do it instead of doing it ourselves.
I want to switch topics just a little bit to something that surprised me when I read the book with World War II, and it's this question of equity. I mean, we know that the climate crisis is the greatest challenge of our time, and we know now that it's deeply interconnected with inequity. The systems that create inequity are the same ones that drive climate change, while climate change in turn drives inequity deeper. And so what I was surprised to read in the book is that the World War II mobilization actually holds some deep lessons for us around creating a fairer society. So can you speak a bit to those lessons?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad that you're digging into this part of it. That, as you see in the slide, is another key lesson, is that inequality itself is toxic to social solidarity. What do I mean by that? So there's lots of climate policy people out there who say, you know, don't link the climate fight to tackling inequality and so all these social justice issues. You know, don't make it more complicated than it needs to be. It's hard enough. And I'm saying I think they're wrong. And I think they're wrong in a few levels. First of all, as you were already saying, Ange, these things are inherently linked. The richer you are, the higher your emissions. The poorer you are as a household or a community or a country, the more vulnerable you are to climate change and more impacted by climate policies. So they have to be linked. But the main reason I'm saying link is because that's how we win. That when you are asking a public to engage in a society-wide mobilization, you need social solidarity for that, and inequality is a key barrier to that. So let me go back into the history a bit. In the First World War, inequality and rampant profiteering, obscene profiteering, had undermined social solidarity. It had actually undermined recruitment efforts. The King government and King himself, who had lived through all of this, was very acutely aware of this. And so at the outset of the Second World War, he was quite resolved to avoid that. So what does the government do? They bring in our first major income transfer programs during the war: unemployment insurance, 1940, the family allowance, 1944. They also bring in new forms of progressive taxation, including an excess profits tax. So the kind of profiteering that we have seen in this pandemic was illegal in the Second World War because of how they structured those taxes. The Marsh Commission, which was this historic commission that really laid the groundwork for the whole post-war welfare system, was written during the war and offered up to Canadians as a pledge and a promise that the society they would come back to would look different and more just than the one they were leaving behind. That's when they start hitting the recruitment numbers they need to hit. That's when you see the cross-society mobilization. The early propaganda efforts in the war that were just like, you know, rally to the flag and go get Hitler, that worked to a point, but only to a point. It's only when you engage the public in what kind of society they would come back to that you start to get the mobilization that we actually needed. And to me, that has a contemporary echo in the appeal of the Green New Deal today, right? That when you link tackling climate with tackling inequality, the levels of support go through the roof. Absolutely. They're far better than what we see for any political party. So that's how we keep, that's how I'm convinced that that's how we get everyone on the bus.
Right. So to follow up on that, you know, you talk about people being galvanized by this vision of a better society on the other side of this war. And I think for us with the climate crisis, it's hard for many of us to visualize what a world on the other side of a just transition could look like. So could you speak to maybe two things? One, you know, the role of the arts in galvanizing people's imagination in the World War II. And the second part of the question would be, what do you think is limiting our imaginations right now to envision that better world?
Great questions. Let me answer them in reverse order in terms of what's limiting. I think you're absolutely right that one of the barriers is that we're asking people to take this leap into a new world in life. And our picture of that is hazy, is fuzzy, and we need to bring that into focus. But also when we think about the imagination that takes, I think one of the challenges we face is the legacy of 40 years of neoliberalism, because that 40-year legacy, it's left a policy legacy that makes this challenging, right? Like all the tax cuts and spending cuts and deregulation and privatization, and going back to my 4 markers, if you ask, well, why isn't the government spending what it needs to spend? Why aren't they creating new crown corporations? Why aren't they using the regulatory power of the state to just require change? It's because 40 years of neoliberalism have told governments that these things aren't allowed. But the
Right.
most insidious legacy of 40 years of neoliberalism is the sapping of our imagination and of our belief and our faith in our capacity to do great things together. So in many respects, the book itself was an attempt to, at an historic excavation of reminding ourselves, oh, look, this is what we were capable of, and the speed and scale of that when we set our minds to it. But within that, to pivot to the other half of your question, the arts played a key role in that. The arts play a key role in any mobilization. You're showing some of the posters. So you had these ubiquitous posters. We sent artists to the front. All kinds of films get produced. Hollywood stars get drawn into the effort. And there was a popular soundtrack of music to the war that was about rallying us. And so I think we need that again today. You know, we're seeing early signs of that. Oh yeah, so this slide that you're showing now is the result of a little competition I put out to some art students through Emily Carr University, that which was to riff off World War II posters and to turn them into climate mobilization posters. So this was the winner by a young woman, Mytel Smith, who took this RCAF recruitment poster and mirror flipped it and turned it into this lovely climate mobilization poster. But also what I love about that, I mean, I love a lot of things about that, to the extent that we're seeing climate art in the present, and it's coming in music and so on, it tends to be pretty dystopian, which is understandable at some level. But it's striking that most of the art of from World War II, despite the fact that the context was horrific, wasn't dystopian. It was like this. It was rallying us to the moment. And I think we need that from the arts community too.
Right. Yeah, I love the hopeful message of this poster. And yes, someone just said in the chat that the posters are in your book in black and white, but it's nice to see them in color. And it's very cool that a student did that poster. I also really love, Elizabeth, can you go back to the previous slide? The galvanizing nature of, especially the second poster, you know, it's sending this message that no matter who you are, what gift you bring, we need you in this collective effort.
That everyone's got a part to play. And some of it's on the battlefront and some of it's on the home front. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a woman's hat there and a, yeah, so I mean, I'm very passionate about the role of the arts. And have you seen any examples of people doing it right in Canada? You want to shout out some of your favorite artists who you think are doing it?
Well, when I first set about to release the book in September, and I was programming these events across the country, I particularly wanted to have musical openers. And so I started contacting musician friends across the country and putting the challenge to them, like, would you open it? But also, maybe would you write a song, and not a dystopian song, a rallying song? And you know, I mean, you can't tell artists what to do, of course, as you know, Ange. Artists are artists, and will do what the spirit moves them to do. But I think everyone loves a challenge, and a bunch of them did take me up on that challenge and started to produce this climate emergency music on my website, which I should share in the chat. I'm going to share the website for my book, and if people scroll down, they can. Here, I'm putting it in there right now. They can see some of that art and music.
Nice. Yeah, and we'll speak a bit to this later, but you know, I'm really excited to see, as you said, with your book openers across the country, when you open the door and give artists the invite, they're happy, mostly happy to jump on board the collective effort. So
yes,
we'll,
because we're all looking for that.
Exactly. We're looking for an open hand to say your gifts are what's needed. Who you are is what's needed. I'll pass it over to Flossie now.
Thank you, Ange. So Seth, I just want to pick up on a breadcrumb that you dropped about 10 minutes ago when you mentioned the federal budget that was announced on Monday. I'd love to hear your hot take about what you think this means for climate action. Are you feeling that there's a disconnect between their numbers and what's required?
Well, yes, there remains a disconnect, and we're still not hitting any of the 4 markers. So on the first one, spend what it takes to win. Actually, helpfully, my old colleagues at the CCPA just published on the National CCPA blog today an article tracking all the budget commitments as well as the previous announcements in the last 6 months, and tallying it all up. What happens with these budget announcements is our governments tend to announce these numbers that sound huge, but they're spread over 3, 5, 10 years. And so Hadrian, in this piece on the CCPA blog, I could even I'll share it in the chat actually while we're speaking, breaks it all down and annualizes it. And when you tally that all up, it's basically about $5 billion a year. There it is in the link. $5 billion a year isn't spending a little less than they should. It is less by a massive order of magnitude. In contrast, the Biden administration is proposing to spend, I did a calculation of this last week, if you convert it to the Canadian context and Canadian dollars, they're proposing to spend about 5 times that, about $25 billion a year. If we were to do what Nicholas Stern says and spend 2% of GDP, we'd be spending about $40 billion a year. But our government is spending about 5. So they're off by a lot in terms of meeting this moment. But and what's interesting in the pandemic experience, just to give you this contrast, from the first lockdown a year ago, March, the Bank of Canada took on the task of buying up federal government securities in order to finance the emergency response to the tune of $5 billion a week. That's what's possible when a government actually recognizes an emergency as an emergency. Are they creating new institutions? No, they're not. As I said before, they're basically trying to incentivize through tax cuts what actually needs to be produced. And we need to move. So we have this updated target that was announced today. I don't know what to make of it exactly. The budget itself only claims to finance enough to produce a 36% reduction. Today, the government announced they want to up the target to 40 to 45%, still inadequate, still not aligned with the science. But they haven't produced a budget plan to actually back that up, even though it only came a few days later. They're not moving to mandatory, right? What I mean by moving to mandatory is we would say you won't be able to buy a fossil fuel vehicle as of 2025. You won't be able to build a new building that ties into natural gas as of next year. That's what Vancouver's done, by the way, but federally and provincially, we haven't. And are they telling the truth? Which is to say, are they saying forthrightly that we have to wind down the fossil fuel sector as the main source of greenhouse gas emissions? No, they're not. They're telling a confusing story, not a forthright story. So we still have a disconnect.
So you've recently launched an organization called the Climate Emergency Unit, which with the aim of trying to bring some of these audacious goals in your book to life. Sierra Club is a part of it. We're helping to build it. Can you tell folks on here kind of what the plans are for the year ahead?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. And I am thrilled that Sierra Club has become a partner with this, and that partnership primarily takes the form of you and Ange, seconded part-time to work with me and the rest of the Climate Emergency Unit team. The origins of this is, as soon as the book came out, and even before it came out, I knew I wanted to spend the next few precious years in emergency mode and trying to animate and advance the emergency scale ideas in the book. I started to do that already. Since the book came out, I've met with many politicians across the country and walked them through the key ideas in the book. But you know, you can only get so far when you're just a guy with a book. And I realized I needed an institutional home again to really put some political muscle behind those ideas. And very happily, David Suzuki and Tara Cullis gave me a home, not with the David Suzuki Foundation, but with the David Suzuki Institute, which is the non-charitable offshoot of the David Suzuki Foundation. So it's a nonprofit, but not a charity, which allows us to do some more direct political engagement than I ever used to be able to do when I was at CCPA. And together raised enough money to recruit an initial team, and then subsequently partner with you folks. So we've got the beginning of a team, and we should share. Okay, so thank you for putting in the chat right now the link to the unit, and people can see the team and the basic ideas. But we are wanting to forge coalition tables of the willing of those groups in emergency mode that want to campaign on emergency wartime scale ideas in the book.
Okay, I have one more question up my sleeve.
Yes.
You say we mobilized in the Second World War, we can do it again, but is there anything about the pandemic this last year that just really gives you hope that we really can rise to this occasion?
Well, the pandemic experience is mixed, of course, right? And the truth is the climate mobilization was really gaining momentum up until the pandemic hit, right? We had this historic student-led day of action. We had a month before the pandemic, these solidarity actions in support of the Wet'suwet'en that were like unlike anything in my lifetime. And all of that's gotten pushed aside a little bit by the pandemic. But in the main, I think we will emerge from the pandemic but better equipped to now tackle the climate emergency. As I alluded to before, on the spending side, the pandemic has laid bare what was possible all along, if and when our governments see emergencies for what they are. I think we come out of it with a somewhat improved sense of social solidarity, notwithstanding the profiteering we've seen. Again, we've been reminded how the public is often ahead of our politics, demanding mandatory changes in terms of that third marker. We've all seen what it looks like when governments communicate in emergency mode and tell the truth, and offer daily press briefings and all of that, what that looks like. I think we emerge with more respect for scientists and the media has in some way found its mojo and realized, in the face of a civilizational threat or an emergency, this is what our job on a daily basis is supposed to look like. So I think in all of those respects, the ingredients are there to help us in this next undertaking.
I agree. We have everything we need. We just need the right structure. We need to be in emergency mode, which is why Flossie and I are so excited to be working with this project. And if you're a supporter of Sierra Club, you'll hear more from us as we continue this work.
Can I say one other thing, Ange, about the pandemic thing? And which is the question of leadership that we all wrestle with, right? Like, are we ever going to get political leadership that rises to this moment? And my takeaway from both the war experience and the pandemic experience is that you never know, but often we're surprised, right? If you had asked Canadians in 1938, this gang in Mackenzie King's government, do they have what it takes to completely transform Canadian society and the economy as they were about to do? I'm certain that most Canadians would have said, no, not this gang. They don't have it in them. And they had no evidence to that point to believe otherwise. And similarly, if you had said to me 14 months ago, are there people at Finance Canada and the Bank of Canada who are capable of quickly pivoting within weeks and creating these audacious new programs like the CERB and the wage subsidy. I hate to say it, but I would have said, no, there's no one home who thinks that way. And I would have been wrong. So
Right.
do we have the leaders we need to rise to historic emergency moments? You never know. Maybe.
It's really cool how you had finished the book and you were going to publication when the pandemic hit.
Yeah.
And it actually reinforced your central argument.
Yeah. The timing was very weird. Yeah, it was all written before the pandemic, and I had shipped it off for final copy edit 3 days before the first lockdown. And then this all happened. It's put me in a bit of a panic because, yeah, to your point, the whole premise of the book was that we needed an historic reminder of how quickly we can move. And yet here we all are experiencing that in real time. And in the end, I think it actually made for fortuitous timing and as you say, reinforced that core notion.
Can I know we don't have much time, but I just, still on that point about leadership, because I think we're all kind of feeling that right now. And early in the pandemic, our leadership, especially in BC, was like touted worldwide. And now there's this kind of, as the crisis has deepened, we're not having so much faith in leadership anymore, or we're seeing maybe that the interests that leadership are protecting are not necessarily the interests of the majority or of the whole.
Yeah. Some of the, you're right, I think that in the first wave, we were impressed by our leadership, and in these subsequent waves, we have been much more disappointed. And I think we've been a little let down in terms of the leadership that we need. That hasn't been true everywhere in the world, right? Like, this is what I mean, that you never know. I mean, look at the leadership of someone like Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand.
Yeah.
And someone who, on both climate and COVID, is really being bold and daring, listening to the science, is ending up showing that it's actually very effective, both in terms of COVID and the economy, and is being politically rewarded for it in an unprecedented way, right? She just got reelected, even though they have proportional representation in New Zealand. She just got reelected with an outright majority, which is almost unheard of in a PR system, but really tells you something about a public that admires and appreciative of the kind of leadership that these moments require.
Right. Our Q&A box is filling up, and I think we have a lot of people who would love to ask you a question. We are also answering some questions by just typing the answers. So look for your question to be answered if it can't be answered live. I'd like to pass it over to Flossie to talk a little bit about how to move forward, what you can do next. And while she's talking about that, and if you have a question, I really encourage you to put it in the Q&A box, not in the chat. In your bottom bar of your Zoom, there's a Q&A box, and you can enter your question there. Thank you so much, Seth. It was very little bit of time to dive into the book, but I hope that it was enough for those of you who haven't read it to go out and buy it right away. And just, thank you so much for diving in with us. I hope we get to do it again.
Can I mention one last thing around these connections with the pandemic?
Sure.
Which is that, people talk about COVID fatigue as well in this wave, and, people are having such a hard time, and here I am saying, oh, well, now we have to spend a few years in emergency mode. But there is an important difference. The things we've been called upon to do in the pandemic are anathema to all of our social instincts, right? Stay home, isolate. That makes it particularly hard. The good news for the climate emergency is that what we're called upon to do is precisely the opposite. To go out and do something grand together. And we can do that for a few years.
Yes, let's make it happen.
Thanks, I love that. Thank you, Seth. Elizabeth, could you throw up the call to action slide? Okay, folks, so there are two really important things that you can do to keep the momentum going, to keep building this audacious speed and scale that we need. The first one, if you haven't done it already, is go and buy the book. It's brilliant. Please buy it at a local bookseller and don't be tempted to Amazon delivery it. The second important thing to do is sign up to Sierra Club BC's new engagement portal, and the link should be going in the chat right now. I'll also send it round over email. We have just launched this new portal, and we've designed it purposely so that we can build a super strong ground game. This is just a screenshot of part of the site, but you'll see that we're inviting folks to sign up to join 5 groups. So artists and storytellers, maybe you want to be one of these people that And and Seth are talking about, who helps other people imagine through their art a better future. You would sign up there. Maybe you want to donate time or in-kind gifts or money, you would join the benefactor group. Maybe you love hosting parties, or you want to get your friends or your sports club or your faith organization taking bolder climate action. You would join the ambassador group, and we would support you to do that. Maybe you're raising a young child. Well, then you're already doing really the most important climate action there is, if you're raising them to help love and respect the land that they live on. And if you join the nurturers group, you will be given resources to help you do that with your kids in the playground or at home more easily. And then we have a group for innovators. So if you have a big idea that you don't see reflected in these other groups, come to us and we'll do our best to help bring it to life. And then the idea is that over the summer, we'll be building these groups deeply and broadly. And when key political moments come along, we will light a match, and suddenly there will be hundreds of artists creating the art that we need. There'll be tons of kids bringing their grandparents into the streets, and there'll be organizations coming to the table. So please, if you do one thing today, let it be signing up to this engagement portal. And I look forward to working with you in the months to come.
Yay. Elizabeth, I believe it's over to you. We have a little bit of time for Q&A. And
Yeah, sorry about that. I just didn't figure out how to unmute myself. Yeah, we have more questions than we're going to have time to answer, but we'll try and follow up with everybody individually so that if there are burning questions that we don't leave you hanging. We have a question here from Jeff Dean, who says, the pandemic and World War II were both immediate, here and now emergencies. The climate emergency is not so immediate and in our faces. How can we get people to see it as needing similar emergency action?
Well, you know, it's a good question. And whether it's the war or the pandemic or climate, I find myself noodling over what's the alchemy, the combination of events and leadership that shifts the zeitgeist and gets people into emergency mode. The one thing I just want to push back though on the question, often when I told people I was writing this book and its premise, people said, as the question just did, sort of, in the war, everyone understood the threat to be clear and present. Except that's not true. If you were in Europe, the war was clear and present. If you were in parts of Asia, the war was clear and present. If you were in Canada, the war was not clear and present. It was on the other side of 2 oceans. And so it actually took leadership and work to get the public on board, like we need again. When you think about the pandemic, we all can remember a year ago what it took, right? We all started, we all, like all crises, begin in a period of denial. And we all started to hear early reports of this virus, but none of us had come to terms with how it was about to upend our lives. And then we all remember certain things, right? Certain events, like, I don't know, I remember the cancellation of the NBA season. I don't even watch basketball, but I remember thinking, boy, that's different. I also know it took seeing my prime minister in front of his house every morning. That communicated emergency. That's what I mean by the leadership. So the curse of climate is that it moves in slower motion. But I would say that the reality is, in terms of the events, and they are primarily extreme weather events, the shift is already happening. So in the polling I commissioned for the book from Abacus Data, what you see in the polling is that a majority of the public already understands that these extreme weather events are climate related, and that they or someone important to them have already experienced them. And so already the terrain has shifted, where if you had asked the same question of 3 or 4 years earlier, where people would have thought of the threat as somewhere else sometime in the future, they now see it here and now. And sadly, that's only going to increase those events. But now we need the political leadership to match that in terms of bringing us into that moment.
Thanks. That brings us to this next question from either Caroline or Carolyn Brindle. What are the barriers that are preventing politicians from either believing or acting that this is an emergency?
Mm. Well, I feel like I've somewhat addressed this. I mean, the barrier is that it moves in slow motion. That makes it easy to kick the can down the road. There is the barrier I mentioned earlier, which is neoliberalism itself, which has prevented people from embracing, political leaders from embracing the necessary solutions, and simply trying to encourage and incentivize our way out of this instead of requiring and taking more decisive action. And that the legacy of that neoliberal straitjacket, if you will, lives in all political parties. And that's something that we need to overcome. The main thing I think we have to overcome right now is what I call a name in the book is the new climate denialism. But what I mean by the new climate denialism is governments and leaders who say they get the science, but continue to practice an agenda that doesn't align with what the science says we have to do. And that really epitomizes our federal government and our BC government.
Yeah, that's the frustration that many of us feel. We have a question from Doreen who asks, during the war, didn't we borrow money from ourselves so it was cheap, but now we get massively in debt because we're borrowing from others?
Yes and no. So in the war, we absolutely borrowed from ourselves. Here, let me just give you some numbers here. In this pandemic year, the federal government's debt to GDP ratio is going from about 30% to 50%. That's a big jump in a single year. But at the end of the Second World War, it was over 100%, more than double that. In the war, it was almost all borrowing from ourselves. In this pandemic, it has also been from ourselves. As I was alluding to before, almost all of that increase in debt this year is held by the Bank of Canada, meaning we have borrowed it from our own Crown Corporation, and any interest we pay on it will return to us. And that's what I mean when I say, after all these decades of being told there wasn't enough money for climate, there's not enough money for homelessness and poverty, this pandemic experience has actually just laid bare what was possible all along.
We have an anonymous question, which I find kind of intriguing, that says, because war practically always involves death, and many overconsumptive and unjust ways of being will probably have to die in the transition for climate justice. How do we support those whose ways of life aren't sustainable and in alignment with a just transition? In thinking about social solidarity. And I think, Canada enjoys high consumption, for example.
Well, we definitely need to consume differently. I mean, first of all, this comes back to my discussion with Ange about inequality. Part of the solution is there are some people in our country and in our world who don't consume nearly as much as they should and need, and then an awful lot of people who consume way more than they need. And so part of the solution is having a taxation system that redistributes that. Part of the appeal of the Green New Deal to me is that embedded in it is a rebalancing of what we pay for on our own and what we do together. And that when you look at the caring economy and social infrastructure in the Green New Deal, at its root, what it's saying is, all that anxiety you feel to make so much money to pay for your kids' childcare and your parents' elder care and your kids' post-secondary education and your pension, chill out. We're gonna do those things together in the Green New Deal. And so do we all need to make as much money as we have become accustomed to? No, actually we don't, because we're going to rebalance those things. But I also, a big chunk of the book is about what do we do for all of those people whose employment is currently tied to the fossil fuel economy. And we do need to make a real offer there and appreciate the anxiety that people feel about their employment and income security. But again, here's the valuable lesson out of the war. There's about 300,000 Canadians who are directly employed in the fossil fuel industry. That's a lot of people, of course. But as I said to you earlier, out of a population of 11 million during World War II, over 1 million enlisted, over 1 million were directly employed in military production, far, far more than are employed in fossil fuel industries today. All of them had to be recruited, all of them had to be trained up, all of them had to be reintegrated into a peacetime economy after the war. We did that with audacious income support programs and housing support programs and post-secondary training programs that transformed the post-secondary sector, doubled the size of the post-secondary sector in the country, and changed the lives of thousands of people. If we could do all of that then, the task today it's actually not nearly as big.
Great. We have a question about are you working with Greenpeace, Eco-Justice, and with other groups? And I'd just like to speak that for Sierra Club BC, we work in partnership with many, many other NGOs. Greenpeace and Eco-Justice all the time. We were involved with the Great Bear Rainforest agreements with Greenpeace, and whenever we're in court, we're often working directly with Eco-Justice. But can you speak more about the Climate Emergency Unit and other groups, NGOs or otherwise?
I mean, our model is deeply, deeply coalition-based. And premised on this notion that we need to create these coalition tables of the willing, of those groups that want to be in emergency mode together, and that none of us, as wonderful as our individual campaigns may be, none of them will be won alone. We're only going to win these ones in common cause, just like in a war. I said earlier that our hope with the unit is to put political muscle behind these emergency ideas in the book, but we go into this enterprise being quite clear that we ourselves are never gonna, the time is short and we're starting from scratch. We're not gonna have that political muscle by ourselves. We will only have that political muscle in coalition with others.
Great. I get a question from our members often about the war analogy. And, when I speak to you and I hear about what you're talking about, I don't hear the, like aggressive, negative connotations that the word war might indicate. But because that can be a barrier to some people, do you have anything that you'd like to share about that sort of uncomfortable analogy?
Yeah, that I share it. I didn't mention this off the top of our chat today, but it's actually where I begin the book, which is to say how awkward this feels. My political activism started as a kid in the peace and disarmament movement in the 1980s. My parents came to Canada as Vietnam draft resistors, pregnant with me. That's why I'm Canadian. So there's great irony in me landing where I did with this book. But as you see when you read it, the book is not particularly interested in the violence and the battles. Is primarily a story about what we did on the home front, and what a society-wide mobilization and economic transformation actually looks like. And the point that I'm trying to make is true mobilizations, and we need a climate mobilization, need to look and sound and feel like emergency mobilizations. And for all of us on this call, like if you look at the federal government and all of their latest climate announcements, and if you look at the BC government and Clean BC and all of its announcement, does any of it look and sound and feel like an urgent and grand undertaking together? I don't think so, but that's what it needs to look like.
Yeah, not so much at the moment. What do you think about Biden's plan? Does that cover any of the 4?
Yes, good question. So actually, I actually did I'm now a regular columnist with the National Observer, and my last piece 2 weeks ago took the 4 markers and applied it to Biden. And interestingly, he's starting to hit the markers. He's spending, in our context, $25 billion a year. He's creating new institutions like the Citizen Climate Corps. He's starting, not sufficiently, but he's moving to mandatory, like the whole electric grid is going to be decarbonized by 2035. And importantly, unlike any federal or provincial government we have, he is starting to tell the truth, which is to say the fossil fuel industry is going to have to be managed for wind down.
Fabulous. Okay, well, we are right at 12. So thank you so much, Seth. We're so excited to have this partnership with you. And I want to thank everybody for attending today. Again, I apologize if we didn't have time to get to your questions. We'll try and follow up with an email and answer some of the ones that didn't get answered. If you do have other questions that you'd like to ask me, feel free to email me at gifts, that's plural, GIFTS, at sierraclub.bc.ca, or feel free to join the conversation on our social media channels. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @SierraClubBC. And of course, today is Earth Day, and as a result, we have a matching gift challenge in effect. So I invite all of you to support our work. Every dollar that you donated will be doubled today, and Maya will put the link to donate in the chat. We also happen to have a fundraising auction, which is live on Facebook. So if you have artwork or other items that you'd like to donate and contribute in that way, please join us there. You can donate your own items, you can bid on items there, and excuse me, help support our work with Seth Klein. Again, thanks so much for joining us today, and happy Earth Day to everyone.
Happy Earth Day, everyone.
Thank you, Seth.
Bye, have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.